Imagine marching more than 20 miles a day, wearing heavy armor, carrying weapons, shields, food supplies, and tools. Imagine sleeping on cold ground, fighting brutal hand-to-hand battles, and knowing that death could come at any moment. Now imagine doing all of this not for gold, not for silver, but for salt. This sounds strange to modern ears, but in ancient Rome, salt was not just a seasoning, it was survival, it was power, and it was a strategic resource that helped build one of the greatest empires in human history. The idea that Roman soldiers were paid in salt is often repeated online, but it is usually misunderstood. Roman soldiers were not handed bags of salt as their full wage. Instead, salt played a crucial role in their compensation, logistics, and daily survival. Understanding why requires us to step into the economic and military reality of the ancient world. Salt was essential for life, especially before refrigeration. It preserved meat, fish, and vegetables, allowing armies to march long distances without starving. Without salt, food rotted quickly. For a professional army like Rome's, which relied on long campaigns far from home, salt was as important as weapons. Rome understood this early. As the Republic expanded, it invested heavily in securing salt supplies. One of the oldest Roman roads, the Via Salaria, literally means the salt road. It connected the salt flats near the Adriatic Sea to the city of Rome. This road existed centuries before the empire, proving how critical salt already was. Roman soldiers needed salt daily. They sweated heavily during marches and training, losing electrolytes. Without salt, muscle cramps, weakness, and illness would set in. In an age with no sports drinks or medical supplements, salt was the only solution. Now let's talk about payment. Roman soldiers were paid in coins, usually bronze, silver, and sometimes gold depending on rank and era. However, they also received allowances for necessities. One of these allowances was salt, or money specifically set aside to purchase it. This allowance was called salarium. The salarium was not always paid in physical salt. Often, it was money designated for buying salt. But the concept mattered more than the form. Salt was considered valuable enough to be officially included in military compensation. This is where language makes history visible. The word salarium comes from the Latin word sal, meaning salt. Over centuries, salarium evolved into the modern word salary. Today, when you receive a salary, you are unknowingly connected to Roman military economics. But why was salt valuable enough to deserve this status? In the ancient world, salt was difficult to obtain. Mining salt required labor, time, and infrastructure. Evaporating seawater took large salt pans in favorable weather. Transporting salt required protected roads and organized supply chains. All of this made salt expensive and strategically important. Rome treated salt as a state-controlled resource. Prices were regulated. Supplies were protected. Shortages could cause unrest. When Rome ensured steady salt distribution, it maintained social stability. For soldiers, salt was more than food preservation. It was morale. A well-fed army fought better. An army that trusted the state to provide essentials remained loyal. Salt became part of the psychological contract between Rome and its legions. This matters because Roman soldiers were not temporary fighters. They were professionals. By the late Republic and early Empire, soldiers served for 20 years or more. They depended entirely on the state for food, pay, and retirement benefits. Salt allowances reinforced this dependency. If a soldier's salt supply was cut, he suffered physically. If it was delayed, morale dropped. Commanders knew this. Ensuring salt delivery was a military priority equal to weapons supply. This is also why salt routes were militarized. Forts were built along supply roads. Bandits targeting salt convoys were treated as serious threats. Disrupting salt supply meant weakening the army without fighting it directly. There is another layer to this story: control. By controlling salt, Rome controlled its soldiers. When your survival depends on a resource provided by the state, rebellion becomes risky. Loyalty becomes rational. Rome understood economics long before modern economists gave it names. Salt also played a role in discipline. Deductions from pay, including salt allowances, were used as punishment. A soldier who disobeyed orders could lose part of his compensation. This turned salt into both reward and control mechanism, and this system worked. Rome expanded from a small city, stayed into a Mediterranean superpower, not just through conquest, but through logistics. Historians often say that amateurs talk tactics, but professionals talk logistics. Rome was professional. By the time of the Roman Empire, salt was embedded in military planning. Campaign routes were chosen based on supply access. Coastal regions and river systems were favored because they allowed easier transport of salt and food. Without salt, long campaigns like those in Gaul, Britain, or the Middle East would have been impossible. This brings us to an important realization. Roman soldiers were not paid in salt because Rome was primitive. They were associated with salt because Rome was advanced. It understood the true foundations of military power supply, nutrition, and morale. And this is only half the story. Because salt did not just sustain soldiers. It reshaped economies, influenced social hierarchies, and left a linguistic legacy that still exists today. To fully understand why salt mattered so much, we need to look at how it affected Roman society beyond the battlefield, and how its value slowly transformed from a survival resource into a symbol of structured compensation. To understand the full importance of salt in the Roman world, you have to step outside the army and look at society as a whole. Rome did not value salt only because soldiers needed it. Salt shaped trade, class structure, and state power. In Roman cities, salt was used daily by every household. The poor needed it to preserve cheap food. The wealthy needed it for large kitchens and banquets. Temples needed it for rituals. Doctors used it for basic medical treatments. Salt touched every part of life. Because of this, Rome treated salt as a public good. In some periods, the state subsidized salt prices to keep them affordable. This prevented riots and food shortages. Controlling salt was a way of controlling the population. This same logic applied to the army. Roman legions were essentially moving cities. Tens of thousands of men, animals, and equipment traveling together. Feeding them was a massive challenge. Salt allowed food to last weeks instead of days. Salted pork, fish, and cheese became staples of military diets. When Roman armies marched, they carried salt or had arrangements to acquire it along the way. Forts were built near salt sources whenever possible. Even temporary camps were placed with logistics in mind. This level of planning gave Rome an enormous advantage over its enemies. Many tribal armies relied on local foraging. If food ran out, campaigns ended. Roman armies could operate year-round, far from home, because they controlled preservation. This is why salt mattered more than gold in certain situations. Gold could pay soldiers, but salt kept them alive. Over time, as Rome's economy monetized further, soldiers received more standardized coin wages. The symbolic role of salt remained, but physical salt payments became less common. However, the language and concept stayed. The salarium became shorthand for regular compensation. Even when soldiers were no longer receiving actual salt, the idea that pay was meant to secure life's essentials remained. This concept spread beyond the military. Civil servants, administrators, and officials also received salarium. The state recognized that loyalty came from stability. Ensuring access to basic necessities kept the system functioning. This is why the word salary survives today. Every modern paycheck carries the echo of Roman logistics. But there is another reason this story matters. It shows how empires are built not just by force, but by systems. Rome did not conquer the world simply because its soldiers were brave. Many societies had brave soldiers. Rome conquered because it solved problems others ignored. Food preservation, supply chains, standardized compensation, infrastructure. Salt sat at the center of all of this. The Via Salaria is a perfect example. It was not built for beauty. It was built for efficiency. Salt moved faster, cheaper, and safer along this road. Soldiers protected it. Merchants depended on it. The state controlled it. This road helped integrate Italy long before political unification. Economics came first. Empire followed. And here is the key lesson. When people say Roman soldiers were paid in salt, they often laugh at the past. But in reality, it should make us respect it. Rome understood value differently. It knew that money means nothing if essentials are missing. It knew that controlling resources matters more than hoarding wealth. This lesson repeats throughout history. Empires rise when they secure logistics. Empires fall when supply chains collapse. Rome lasted as long as it did because it never underestimated basic needs. Eventually, as the empire grew too large, supply lines stretched too far. Corruption increased. Salt subsidies failed. Inflation hit coinage. Military loyalty weakened. Logistics broke down. When the salt roads could no longer support the army, Rome began to lose control. So the story of salt is also the story of Rome's rise and fall. It began with a simple mineral that preserved food and ended with complex systems that could no longer sustain themselves. And that is why Roman soldiers were paid in salt. Not because salt was primitive, but because salt was power. If you understand salt, You understand Rome.